In ancient Mesopotamia, the highest god was Anu, whose name means sky. He lived in the heavens with his consort, the earth goddess Ki. Together they ruled over the underworld, the home of the dead, and the three other directions of the world. But they weren't alone. They were served by an elite group of divine officials known as the Anunnaki, whose name literally meant those who have descended. For decades, scholars believed that these Anunnaki were just a bunch of minor deities, associated with everything from grain to beer to sex. But thanks to new discoveries, we now know that this couldn't be further from the truth. So join me as we explore the recently uncovered origins of the Anunnaki, only here. What's going on, guys? Welcome to my channel, where we explore ancient history and current events from an insider's point of view. This is the first episode of a multi-part series that will take you back to the dawn of civilization. We'll get to hear about some of the truly shocking things that these old Mesopotamians got up to. And best of all, we'll do so through the eyes of those who experienced it firsthand, the people who actually lived it. Because, unlike archaeologists and historians, most of whom are long dead, I'm bringing you stories directly from the past. In this episode, we're going to look at the official records from one of the biggest temples in the ancient world. It's called the Ekkur Temple of Nippur, and it was dedicated to the god Enki, who we met last time. It was huge, covering over 7 acres at the height of its power. And it boasted more than 200 rooms for housing priests, priestesses, and their families, as well as administrative staff. With all these people living together in close quarters, it must have been a bit like trying to run a large corporation today. So let us start out by finding out what a typical day was like working at the Ekkur Temple. Now, before we jump into the daily routine, we need to understand how a full day was divided. The ancient Mesopotamian day started at sunrise and ended at sunset. That's right. They didn't stay up late to watch TV or play video games. They went straight to bed when the sun went down. But even though each day began and ended at the same time every day, there were no two identical days. Each one was unique because the gods themselves decided how long each hour would last. You see, the length of a day depended on how long the gods wanted it to be. So if they wanted to make a day longer, they could stretch out an hour for as long as they wanted. And if they were feeling lazy, they could shorten it to make the day end earlier. And don't think that they didn't take advantage of this power. Just ask anyone who's ever had to work a double shift or pull an all-night. The gods loved to mess with people's schedules. They knew that messing with people's lives was funny, but sometimes it wasn't so funny for the humans involved. Imagine showing up to work and finding out that your boss has decided to change your shift without asking you first. That kind of thing doesn't happen very often in our world, but back then, it happened all the time. And the only thing you could do about it was complain to the gods. As you can imagine, life in ancient Mesopotamia was pretty chaotic. One minute everything was fine, and the next minute your whole world was turned upside down. But despite all this chaos, people still had to get their work done. They had crops to harvest, animals to care for, and temples to build. And it wasn't easy. Back then, there was no such thing as air conditioning or even electricity. So people had to rely on the natural world around them to get the job done. If it was hot, they'd find shade under a tree or take a dip in a nearby river. And if it was cold, they'd huddle around a fire or wrap themselves in warm clothes. But no matter what the weather was like, people still had to get their work done. They couldn't just take off from work whenever they felt like it. In fact, they were expected to work even harder when the weather was bad. For example, if there was a flood, people would have to work overtime to rebuild their homes and farms. Or if there was a drought, they'd have to work even harder to make sure their crops didn't die. Basically, life was tough in ancient Mesopotamia. People had to deal with all the same problems we have today, plus a few extra. But somehow they managed to create some of the most advanced civilizations in history. So maybe it wasn't so bad after all. So, let's say you finally made it to the end of your shift. The sun's dipping low, casting long shadows across the temple walls, and you're more than ready to call it a day. Maybe even sneak in a short nap before the evening duties begin. But not so fast. Just because the main tasks are done doesn't mean you're completely off the hook. There's always something else. A broken seal to reinscribe, a grain inventory to double, or worse, the high priest might ask for a last-minute update on the day's offerings. And that means more writing, more lists, more clay. So, you stay a little longer, quietly, patiently, because in temple life, the gods never really go to sleep, and neither do the record. Because if you're a worker at the Ikut temple, your day isn't over until you've finished recording the day's offerings and tributes. That's right. Even in ancient times, people had to keep detailed records of their work. But don't worry, it wasn't all that bad. Most of the time, your job would be pretty simple. Just writing down the names of people who made donations to the temple. Mostly small things. Grain, incense, maybe a loaf of bread. But occasionally, something more valuable would come through, like a sheep. Or even an ox. On those days, things got a little more interesting. If you were lucky, you might be allowed to stay inside the temple, quietly observing the rituals. And maybe even enjoying a portion of the offering once the ceremony was complete. But not every day was that peaceful. Some days, you'd be sent out into the city, walking narrow, dusty streets, to collect taxes from local farmers. And let's just say, this wasn't exactly the highlight of the job. Farmers weren't always eager to give up a share of their hard-earned harvest. Many tried to cheat the system, underreporting their grain or hiding livestock. It was your job to spot the deception and make sure they handed over what they owed, preferably without too much argument. Not glamorous, not heroic, just another long day in the service of the gods. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, why does this guy care so much about money? Isn't he supposed to be a religious figure? Well, back in those days, being a religious figure didn't mean you were above making money. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Being a priest gave you access to a lot of power and wealth. After all, you were in charge of collecting taxes from the people and deciding how much of that money would go towards building projects. It was a big responsibility, but someone had to do it. And since nobody else wanted the job, priests were more than happy to step up. But before we move on, I want to talk about something else that's really important to me. And that's you, my viewers. You see, I love making videos about ancient history. It's my passion, but I couldn't do it without you. Every time you hit that subscribe button or leave a comment, it lets me know that what I'm doing is valuable and worth continuing. So thank you for that. I truly appreciate it, and I hope you continue to join me on my journey through time. You may be wondering how you keep track of all the different offerings and tributes coming into the temple. Well, the answer is simple. You'd use a record keeper. Record keepers were responsible for making sure that every offering was recorded correctly. They also had to keep track of who made the offering and what it was for. This information was then used to decide how much money to give back to the person who made the offering. It was a lot of work, but someone had to do it. And believe me, if you were a record keeper, You had one of the most important jobs at the temple. Now let us say you re one of the lucky few who gets to carve cuneiform into soft clay tablets. You might think that this would be a relaxing job, but trust me, it's not. First of all, you have to spend hours every day perfecting your cuneiform. And even then, you'll never be able to memorize the entire list of deities. There are just too many of them. Not to mention the pressure of knowing that every mistake you make will be permanent. You can't simply erase a mistake and start over. You have to use a special tool to smooth out the clay and start again from scratch. No wonder only the most skilled scribes were allowed to carve cuneiform into clay tablets. If you thought that was a lot of pressure, try being a priest who had to perform ritual purification ceremonies. During these ceremonies, you had to observe everything that was happening very carefully. If you missed anything, it could ruin the ceremony and bring bad luck upon the temple. You had to be alert and focused at all times. And believe me, that was no easy task. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new. If you did, please hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about the ancient world, check out my other videos. Thanks for watching.